After losing ground in the Middle East, ISIS is attempting to resurrect itself in Africa. The New York Times reports that the Islamic State has, quote, leveraged its loose ties to Islamic extremists to try and project an image of strength and inspire its supporters worldwide. Violence committed by militant Islamists has been rising across the continent for the past year. According to the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, attacks associated with those groups spiked 43% in 2020. ISIS most recently claimed responsibility for a deadly attack in northern Mozambique last month, where local militants ambushed the port town of Palma. Dozens of people were killed. Tens of thousands fled to neighboring provinces to escape the violence. According to local police, last week, 12 people believed to be foreigners were found beheaded near a hotel where expats were taking refuge. For more on all of this, let's bring in New York Times reporter Christina Goldbaum. She joins me now from Johannesburg, South Africa. Christina, thanks for being here. Really just terrible information. So tell us more about what ISIS is doing to try and regain power. And are there signs that it's working?
So I think for the last couple of years, what we've seen is the Islamic State forging alliances with militant groups across the continent, from Nigeria to Mozambique and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Many of those ties are actually quite loose. So there's very little evidence that the Islamic State is providing training, expertise, financing to these groups across the African continent. But what we're seeing is a sort of marriage of convenience between these militant groups and the Islamic State, where for local militant groups, being able to fight under the Islamic State's flag confers those groups some legitimacy and recognition from local governments. And for the Islamic State, they are able to claim credit for attacks by these militant groups across the continent, and in doing so, really build momentum and create an image that they are building strength, send the message to their supporters that they are still very strong, that they are taking parts of the continent that they had not before. And so it is a win-win, essentially, for the militant groups and for the Islamic State, that the group can, again, offer legitimacy to local groups with local grievances. And in exchange, it can create an image of really spreading across the continent. Again, though, I think it's really important to note that the ties between the Islamic State and these groups is often incredibly loose, but the image that they are presenting is that, they have created inroads and footholds across Africa. And I don't think we've quite seen evidence to suggest that quite yet, although I know that many European and American officials are afraid that this could be the beginning of something like that happening.
So if that's the image that they're trying to project, Christina, can you tell us what condition is the Islamic State in as a global terrorist organization?
So American officials have said that the core of the Islamic State is still strong. They are now only around 10,000 fighters that have gone mostly underground. They still have, $100 million war chest at their disposal. But, obviously in the last 2 years, they have lost a lot of their strongholds in Syria and in Iraq. And so I think part of what we're seeing now, too, is the group playing up wins in other parts of the world to create that momentum and continue that momentum, because they have suffered stinging defeats, again, in Syria and Iraq and their former strongholds.
So tell us about the shift to Africa. What made the continent more vulnerable?
I think for many years we've seen, again, local militant groups with kind of seeing a volatile mix of local grievances spring up across the continent. These are groups that are operating often in ungoverned territories and in places that have pretty weak security systems. So, you have the beginnings of what could be massive insurgencies in places like Mozambique that started out with a couple of hundred people a few years ago. But they're operating in a space where the government institutions are incredibly weak, where many young people have seen elites or politicians, benefiting from, resources in the area, and that kind of money not trickling down into smaller, fishing communities, farming communities. And at the same time, as those groups begin to build momentum, there aren't very strong militaries in order to counter them. So that you don't have very strong security services that can contain what's beginning to become a growing threat. And so we've seen that happening, from Nigeria to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, across the Sahel region. And I think Mozambique is a great example because, again, the insurgency in the northeast of that country numbered only around a couple of hundred people 3 years ago. And now that insurgency has grown to be, a couple thousand people strong. They have displaced nearly 700 people in the area due to fighting and killed at least 2,000 civilians. And that's all happened in the course of 3 years. And that's just one example of, I think, what we've seen across the continent, of these kind of small local groups growing in size and, confronting militaries that aren't ready to handle this kind of threat.
Given what you're saying, Christina, about this being in many ways the work of small local groups that then feed into the image of the Islamic State, how serious is the threat posed by the group, not only in African countries, but international, given that it is so diffuse?
Well, I think two things. We've seen, in Africa, again, even by creating these very loose ties to these groups, that opens up the door to creating, stronger relationships with them. Already in Nigeria, that's probably the one place that we've seen the Islamic State providing trainers and offering some expertise to their affiliate there. And the fear is that that could grow, where they have these relationships, loose relationships, the groups in other places as well. And if those bonds become stronger, then they could also provide expertise to make those insurgencies that much stronger and disrupt large parts of these countries. I think the other fear is that in being able to take credit for attacks that these local militant groups have waged, again, that has a huge boon for a group that relies so much on momentum and image to inspire its supporters worldwide and make sure that they still believe that the global jihad is alive and well, and continue to build momentum in that way. And so I think right now we've seen that happening. A lot of researchers have noted that after the Mozambique attack, when the Islamic State claimed credit for that there was chatter online around, creating new caliphates across Mozambique. And so we've already begun to see some of those kind of downstream impacts of that happening. And we also have to remember that, over the last year, the Islamic State, from 2019 to 2020, the Islamic State took credit for, a third more, over 30% more attacks in Africa. So just the image that creates does build momentum. I think now what we're going to see is, in the next couple of years, is the group able to strengthen its ties to those small local groups and begin providing that expertise so that those groups become even more deadly and, what is really isolated pockets of violence, if that spreads across, to other countries or not. I think that's what we're going to see in the next couple of years.
So given the trajectory that you say the Islamic State is on, how are international leaders responding?
So, for example, in Mozambique, the U.S. has now sent trainers to train the Mozambican military there. Portugal said, that after this latest attack in the northeast, which the Islamic State claims killed 55 people, that they will also send military trainers to the country to try to bolster the local military there. I think the concern, though, even with that is, the Mozambican military and militaries in other parts of the continent that have also seen some ISIS presence. Those militaries are often implicated in a lot of, human rights abuses, violence against civilians. And so while it is important to train those groups, and we are seeing, again, more international attention to training those local militaries in order to counter ISIS affiliates across the continent, there is also a simmering fear that you are, arming and training up, local militaries that are not necessarily, don't always have the best human rights record as well. And so that also could have implications down the line. And I think that's top of mind for a lot of human rights researchers as well.
Such an important issue. Christina Goldbaum, thank you.
Thanks for having me.